I'm here with Matt from Netlify, who's the CEO of Netlify, and we're here in the beautiful Fairmont Hotel in the penthouse for Compose Conference 2024. So thank you for joining me, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you've been a big advocate for composable architecture. The conference is called Compose.
Yeah.
How do you see AI changing that landscape and evolving over the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, AI is going to be a catalyst for driving even more attention on composable architectures, right? Like if you think about like some of the really big trends we'll see coming out of AI, the first is just like there's a lot of things that are really hard to predict, and then there are things that are really easy to predict. And one of the easy predictable thing is just acceleration, right? Like more content, more code, more assets, more like faster throughput, right? Like again, I think systems that are geared for high volumes of throughput is going to be even more important than they were before, right? Like, so we've always had a lot of focus on helping our customers iterate and ship faster by decoupling like the layer that's the actual web experience from all the different backend systems and sort of make sure it's not tangled closely together. And we've seen that when we do that, we can help that level of throughput of content, code, and data flowing through the system, right? Like if AI is going to accelerate the amount of content, the amount of data, the amount of assets, the amount of code, then that level of throughput is going to be even more important. And I don't think you will get that with like a very big monolithic system. But then the other thing I'm a pretty big believer in is that right now we are mainly using AI to build the kind of experiences for users and customers that we've been building for decades now, right? Like we're building them faster, but it's still very much the same things we're building, right? Like, and I think over the next 5 years, we'll see a lot of shifts in that. We'll start actually figuring out what does these new paradigms make possible that you could never do before. And I think there's like this underlying constraint where since the very first human-computer interfaces, they were transactional and deterministic in the sense that like you needed to give a computer precise instruction, click a button, it does something precise, write a command, it does something precise, right? Like, and that constraint has sort of quietly gone away, right? Like suddenly a computer can understand your intent and go out and do stuff on its own, right? Like, and I think we still have translated that into how is that going to change the kind of experiences we build. But over the next 5 years, I'm sure we will. And again, I think that will just like change cycles in what you as a company or you as a developer or you as a builder, it's going to be changing constantly the expectations for what it is you have to build and how it's going to look and feel like and how it's going to be like. And I think, again, if you're stuck in some big monolith where the experiences you build are tied to the transactional commerce engine you use or the content engine you use or whatever, right? Like you're going to have a big problem just keeping up with that and exploring all of those different paths, right? Like, so I think that will push even more towards like a composable paradigm of like make sure we can build very different experiences quickly on top of different APIs and services that supports these functionalities without having to be tied into one big monolith. And I think we're already seeing, right, like that all the way people integrate AI into any product is through APIs and services, right? Like it's not by buying some AI monolith, right? Like it's already very clear that that's the direction, right? Like, so I think these three trend lines will push more people towards composable architectures organically.
Yeah, it would, we've been a big proponent of like composable architecture. And one of the things I noticed when I first started using AI is that if you really break down the problem into very, very small micro tasks, it does a lot better. So if you think about that from your technology stack, and if you break that down and you're doing these little individual composable pieces, it really accelerates your ability to adopt AI.
Totally. I think the more you have like isolated pieces you can work on in isolation with like a smaller context needed to work on that piece, the more you will also benefit from applying AI to your workflows.
Yeah. So You talked about how, we're still in the early stages. I kind of almost equate it to like the rise of like the graphical browser,
Totally,
right? How
totally.
people were using the internet before the graphical browser and then after.
Yeah,
And even when the graphical browser came out, they were still doing very text-based, very,
yeah,
it took
yeah.
a while for like
Took
the
a while.
first click ad,
Yep.
better or for worse, to come up.
Yeah,
Throughout the history of Netlify, you started off with like the JAMstack and kind of, really you're championing this, secure, fast way to build websites, which is kind of static building. How do you see that paradigm and that architecture changing with the new technologies and the new stacks that are evolving?
I mean, I think we've seen like we introduced the concept of like serverless functions as part of this stack in the start of 2018, right? Like so a long time ago now, and we've seen that become more and more of like something you take for granted, right? Like that your front end cloud platform also has a backend for the front end that can run code on the fly, do server side rendering if needed. We've seen like edge functions become a bigger and bigger like part, bigger and bigger primitives for many of our customers, right? Like really taking advantage of being able to write code at that layer very close to the user and do personalization and so on, right? Like I think that layer of personalizing on the edge will only become more important as we can use AI to actually both have more content to personalize around and better decision-making processes on what to do. I think the core part of the JAMstack that stuck around and like that's been essential has been this idea of decoupling the actual web stack from your actual backend stack, right? Like and use web native technologies and primitives to build the actual web layer versus having it coupled to your backend stack or your business logic or pieces like that. I think one thing like I'm excited for is like this idea of potentially moving for some applications even more load actually into the web layer in these local first approaches that are still sort of in the early stages. But if you think of like an app like Linear that we are like heavy users of at Netlify, everyone that tries that gets this sensation of like, wow, this feels like a completely different level of performance and interactivity than what we're used to, right? Like, and that's because they've taken this approach of like, let's sync the whole project database into a database in the browser and then build this sync engine so everything you change somewhere far away or somewhere in the browser will converge and you'll always see an up-to-date view, right? Like, and I think gradually we're starting to build like the abstractions to go from having that way of building apps being very, very hard to do to gradually making it simpler to do. And I think there will be a certain threshold where if that becomes simple enough to do, we'll start seeing it like that paradigm grow a lot more. And I think that paradigm will fit really well in a world with a lot of AI agents going off and doing stuff, because it'll essentially like right now, multiplayer applications are sort of something you need for very specific things, but not that often, right? Like, but if you imagine that almost everything you do have like AIs running off and doing stuff in the background, suddenly sort of everything we build will tend to become multiplayer by default, not by a lot of humans, but one human and a bunch of agents doing things, right? Like, so I think when I see the future of this like decoupled stack, I see that piece being really, really interesting.
Interesting. So you're going back, you mentioned kind of loading it down at the local level, like at the local, and then kind of using for the speed, the local.
Using the local browse. Like, I mean, again, I think that there's always this swing back before like server side rendering, client side rendering, server client, and so on, right? Like, and I think right now, I honestly think we're in a little bit of a weird point where we've introduced a lot of abstraction and a lot of complexity around rendering stuff. It's not that hard to render in reality, right? Like, I think a lot of the things that I see people building with like things like streaming React server components and so on, right? Like it's like, it's not really different from any of the things we built without streaming React server components 5 years ago. And the performance differences are not really that big, and you can solve the problems, the very real problems that these abstractions solve in other ways that feels often simpler to me. Um, and I tend to think that it would be healthy for us to like try to rein down the level of abstraction and complexity for building like the things that are actually not that hard, but use some of our complexity budget to then think about like how can we all build experiences that are way more interactive, way more real time, way more like multiplayer between us and agents and system acting out in the world on our behalf. And I think like some of these concepts around like local data storage and sync engines that can make sure that the data that's relevant to the user currently viewing the app is just like always up to date. I think that can potentially play a really big role in that if we can make it simple enough to reason about and use.
So one of the biggest reasons I started using Netlify a number of years ago, and one of the biggest reasons because it took an abstraction layer out of it, it made it very easy for builders to get up and going. And now you see new tools coming out like Cursor, you see all these AI tools that are helping, people that are putting up YouTube videos like, hey, I just built this app and Cursor launched it on Netlify. Never learned code before my day. And I know a lot of web developers are a little scared of AI.
Yeah.
And I think that I'd love to hear your opinion on how you think this affects the overall like builder ecosystem. What do you think it's going to create more builders, or do you think it's going to, as some fear, take our jobs?
I think we'll have more builders. Like I think it'll like there's this economic law called Jevons paradox that says that when the cost of a resource goes down, the demand goes massively up, right? Like, and I think if the cost of custom development goes down, demand for custom development will radically go up, right? Like people will not settle for something that was just like a template out of the box if they know that, hey, if you put a little effort, we could like use Cursor or something and do something really custom for me, right? Like, but I don't necessarily think that means that everybody want to do everything for themselves, right? Like, so I think like that all of this tooling will only accelerate the amount of developers and the amount of builders. And I still think you need like a lot of domain knowledge to use this technology, like, right? Especially the more complex, like the things you build become. And I think one thing I've been thinking a lot about is there's this old talk from QCon a long time ago by Rich Hickey, the creator of the Clojure programming language called Simple Made Easy, I think. That's like a brilliant talk about like the difference between simplicity and ease, right? Like where, for example, if you ask some AI to spit out a whole bunch of code that might be really easy, but it might not be simple to reason about afterwards.
Yeah.
What is going on, right? Like what is happening is like, versus if you sit down and write the same thing in like a purely functional programming language with no mutable state and so on, right? Like that's probably going to be really hard, but you're going to get a very simple result. That's probably very easy to reason about, right? Like, and I think a lot of what I think about in where we sit in the stack is like, how do we build those right balances, to make it easy to do something simple rather than make it easy to do something complex. Because the more we layer on automation and so on, the more we get this risk of creating sort of a complex system that's not composed of simple building blocks, and that we just kind of lose our ability to understand. And I think no matter what we do, navigating that balance will be skill you learn and an ability you learn as you work with these models and agents. So I would recommend every developer to immediately start adopting tools like Cody or Cursor, or like start really playing around with and start seeing what Claude can do from you. Like start experimenting with what ChatGPT can do for you. Get good at using these, right? Like, because it will be if you don't, then you risk losing your job, but not to an AI, but to the developers that picked up AI and are now like just like much better at building stuff than you, right? Like, but I still think that picking up AI tools is a real skill set, and I still think you can't use them well in a real world setting unless you understand like the basics of the systems they're interacting with, and unless you can guide them in the direction of the right kind of architecture, not just for getting like the initial hello world experience, but for building something you can evolve over time and iterate on and maintain.
Yeah, I think there's a lacking of like tools that can help do things in production, and everything you see out there is like, oh, I started this from scratch. Yeah. Everyone knows that it's much easier to start something from scratch than to actually maintaining. I think
always
when you said the simplicity, I remember hearing something. I was like, it used to take me an hour to code it, then 15 minutes to debug it. Now it takes 2 seconds to develop it and 3 hours to debug it.
Yeah, totally.
So last year and over the past few years, you've been gradually rolling out. You rolled out documents with AI. You rolled out, being able to, look at your logs using AI.
Yeah.
How do you see AI playing a role in the products you're going to be launching for Netlify?
Yeah.
Do you have any plans to support like other services like RAG, for instance, that do require kind of that infrastructure in the background?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think at Netlify, when I think about AI, I think about it kind of in 4 pillars. First is like, how are we going to use AI at Netlify internally to move faster and be more efficient, right? Like, how can we use it in support, and how can we use it like we have tools like an AI that will give me a summary every week from the status of all the main projects in Linear, right? I can give like instead of the teams having to compile that, we have AI doing it, right? Like, so that's the first pillar of like, how do we actually use AI? The second is like, how are our customers building AI-driven applications with Netlify, right? Like, and obviously we're constantly looking at what are the core platform primitives we need to put in place to make it easier to build on top of AI, right? Like, and what are the extensions we need to have in place? What are the sort of capabilities? And I touch a little more on some of the things we're launching there. Then the third pillar is like, how do we use AI to improve our own product, right? Like, what features can we build that we couldn't build before? And there we have like a very clear philosophy of like, our product is not about deciding what you should do as a developer, right? Like, we've always seen like this set of tools. It's like VS Code and GitHub and the frameworks you choose and the libraries you choose and like how you actually write the code. That's not where we have an opinion, right? Like, but we've always seen it as our role to make sure that the time from writing that code and to actually having it like through Q&A, through the release process, on a URL, in production, in a scalable environment in front of customers, that's where we want to like make the time to market as short as possible, right? Like, so when we're thinking about AI inside of our product, we're thinking about what can we do there. And I'll talk a little bit more about like what we are doing there.
Yeah, I want to hear about your
The last part of AI that's really interesting is like, how does AI use Netlify, right? Like,
okay,
so we have more than 1,000 sites published on Netlify every day from ChatGPT, for example, right? Like through the Netlify GPT, from people like chatting with ChatGPT and say, okay, publish some stuff on Netlify. And that GPT, you can interact with it from other GPTs. It's integrated into the Grimoire GPT and so on, right? Like, so those kind of flows. Devin, if you've seen like the AI engineer and so on, also like has a Netlify integration and will like deploy web apps on Netlify out of the box and so on, right? Like, so there's a whole interesting area on like, what does the AI needs from us to make it easier for them to work with Netlify and drive stuff. So those are kind of like the 4 pillars, right? Like our internal usage, our customers, what are our customers building, what are we building, and what are AI's building, you could say, right? Like, so some of the things we're announcing here at Compose that are related to that, like, the first sort of abstractly related piece is the next version of our SDK that really makes Netlify's whole platform even more programmable. You can now build like configuration UIs for other services inside Netlify. You can give them space there, right? Like, we can bring this world of like our world of the front end, and then all these services you need to power the back end much, much closer, right? Like in launching with a really cool set of partners and functionalities that you can enable through extensions. And obviously some of those will be really relevant to AI-driven app. I know Glauber from Terso, for example, that's one of our launch partners, has a really great point of like, Terso is this idea of like SQLite databases that can sync, and you can like very easily give like every user their own database and work in that and so on, right? Like, and that can be really interesting for some AI applications where you might not, as a company, implement an AI feature, be totally confident and like, let's just give AI access to our whole database and it can just do whatever, right?
Kind
like
of segregating the data.
But if you can give it just like a ready-made SQLite database that's synced and like has vector embeddings and so on, and say like, go crazy there, right? Like that can probably lead to some really, I can see people building some really cool stuff there. Now, one of the features we're building in terms of like, how can we make time to market faster through AI, ties into the announcement of our visual editing layer last year, which is really more of just saying like, when you are in this composable workflow and you often have different content sources and you have chosen like a developer first platform like Netlify, how can we be inclusive of the whole web team that's part of that, right? Like how can we make sure that now the product marketeers and so on are not stuck in ticket vortex where every single thing they need to do needs to go through a developer? How can we give developers tools to solve those problems from the others that are there? How can we create like surface area within our product to even open that up for extensions and so on, right? Like, and then one of the things we've just observed is that when we look at the workflow of a web team launching, for example, like a new product page or even something as simple as a blog post, right? Like in Netlify, and I think this is typical for most companies, whether it's a blog post or whether it's a product post or whether it's a guide for our developer hub, regardless of where that content end up being stored, like for our website, we're using Sanity as the headless like content infrastructure for our developer hub. It's in Git and so on, right? Like the actual creative work takes place in Notion or Google Docs, right? Like that's where everybody collaborates and sort of nails down there's like commenting, and then it's like nailed down and it's like ready for publishing. And then you need to find someone to get it into the web world, right? Like how do we get it into structured content? How do we pick the right templates to match it with? How does all of that happen, right? Like, and that feels again similar from how we saw that once you finished writing the code and pushed it to GitHub, well, and there was like all of these endless steps before it was in front of the user, right? Like, so that's one of the areas we've been thinking about. How can we use AI to do that chore of like, take my Google Doc, take my Notion doc, get it into the template, get it into the CMS, get it ready, give me the preview, and now let me do the validations and tweaks and so on and get it ready for publish, right? Like, but don't require me to figure out like someone that has access to the CMS and can plug it in. So we call that AI-assisted publishing. And it really just allows you to say like, hey, if you've set up your presets and your content modeling, so our system knows where the content should live and what kind of templates you have to choose between, you can really just tell us, take this Google Doc or take this Notion doc and get it into my system. It'll do all the grunt work. It'll give you a preview, and now you can edit and ship. Again, just aligning with this philosophy of how do we help people ship faster. And then if you tie that back into like, how do people build AI functionalities with Netlify? Well, we build all of this with Netlify, right? Like, so obviously we ran into a lot of things of like, how do we do this with Netlify? How do we do it with like serverless functions and so on, right? Like, sure, it's like very API driven interactions, right? Like it's obviously all like OpenAI behind the scenes for most of these. We probably built some abstractions to try out different models for different parts of it and so on, right? Like, but it's not simple, like, it's not the simple API world we're used to of like, call an API and get a response and show it, right? Like we tend to end up building asynchronous workflows that's more like, take this piece, get it ready for a prompt to this model, wait for that prompt to come back with some decisions on what to do next, then spin up the next tasks, then take this output and put it over here and so on, right? Like, and I think that sort of those patterns becomes really evident as something like you kind of always run into when you build these kind of AI driven experiences. So we build internally this whole workflow engine on top of our core primitives, on top of serverless functions and blob storage and scheduled functions and so on. And what we're launching here at Compose really combines all the other things, because we've packaged all of that up as an extension through our new SDK, and we're launching that as like async workflows extension that you can just install on your account, and now you can start taking advantage of this whole workflow engine for building your own sort of AI applications.
Yeah, I've had a chance to take a look at it, and it's absolutely amazing. I can't wait to use this with my customers. And it's glad to see that you're also not just focusing on developers, but also like, the production of, the non-developers, because like you said, that's not the creative part. Leaves more time for creativity.
Totally.
So, well, I really appreciate your time, Matt, and good luck with everything.
Thanks so much.